You know, the biggest misconception I've noticed people have of me when they've seen the notes that I've made is that they think I have this incredible magical ability to take things like lecture slides and textbooks that may seem unengaging and transform them into these wonderfully presented, aesthetically pleasing summaries that I used to learn. And they think that I can do all of this in just one step. And I'm here to tell you today that that is an absolute lie. There is a middle step, and it's big, and it's chaotic, and it's messy, and it's not the sort of thing that people would normally show on YouTube or Instagram to show off studying, but that, my friends, is today's video. Also, I made a new intro. Good evening everyone on this fine evening. Welcome back to another video. If you're here for the first time, welcome. It is lovely to have you. My name is Samuel. I'm a third year university student, and today I'm going to show you how I take notes in lectures. Side note, in the perfect reality where you are the perfect student who's enthusiastic with the perfect lecturer who has the perfect slides and who communicates well, this video is sort of pointless. But I think we all know that most of the time, and by most I mean 99.99% of the time, things just aren't as simple as they should be. And that's kind of shaped the way that I approach lectures for the past few years in university. And so I thought the best way to communicate today's video is actually to give you 3 different examples of notes that I've taken inside lectures and how the approach changes depending on the type of content I'm learning. But before we go on, I think it's important to go into the things I take with me when I walk into a lecture room. So back in my first year of university, or the Stone Age as I like to call it, I used to have a printed out set of lecture slides with me, which I used to annotate with my highlighters and different color pens. And I would also have a notebook with me, which I'd write an extra set of additional notes. And to this day, nothing has changed apart from the fact that now it's all digitized. Now I have my lecture slides downloaded and stored on my iPad in an app called Notability, for those of you who haven't heard it before. So within the app, I basically have all the tools I need to highlight and annotate the slides. Now alongside Notability, a lot of the times I have another app on the iPad known as GoodNotes open, and it sort of acts as a notebook where I can jot down notes separate to the lecture slides. By the way, I use black paper. I absolutely love black paper. A lot of people have been asking about it, and so I have linked it down in the description for free download. And you're welcome. Alright, so now I think we should move on to the first lecture that I want to talk about, and that is cardiology. For those of you who have no idea what cardiology means, it's basically a part of the physiology course, and it means the heart. Quick story, the year before my year, cardiology was actually a huge lecture. I think it was like 120 slides. And it was so big that the students in the university complained, and the next year they split up that one lecture into 2 lectures and they got rid of another lecture. And I still thought that even after they split it up, that half a cardiology lecture was too much to be learning inside one lecture. And I knew that I did not have the ability to just sit back in my chair and passively absorb all this information being thrown at me for 2 hours straight. And so I decided to do something that was a little unusual to the students around me. I actually decided to write down all the questions that popped into my head as I was going through the lecture. And I got to admit, it made me feel really dumb. But I knew that it was better than coming out of the lecture with nothing. So as I said, I basically wrote every question that came into my head. What is the aortic valve? What is the difference between the pulmonary and systemic circuit? Why are the walls of the left ventricle much thicker than the walls of the right ventricle? What are the 2 types of cells found in the heart? How does the heart supply itself with blood? What is an action potential? What is an ECG? What on earth is a ventricle? I actually knew that at the time, and so I spent the entire lecture just doing that. and I tried to understand what I could, but I wasn't too fussed about coming out with all the answers and absorbing all the information, because I'd worked out by that point that identifying what I don't know or asking questions was the secret to learning. So immediately after the lecture, I actually found a friend and I spent 15 to 20 minutes just quickly going over the lecture again and trying to see, is there any way I can break this thing down further? And you know what's really cool? I actually realized that I could group a lot of these questions that I had into certain categories. For example, I was able to group the first few questions that I had under the title of General Anatomy of the Heart. The next section I titled Pulmonary versus Cardiac Circulation, Types of Cells Found in the Heart, Action Potentials, which are these electric impulses that control your heartbeat. And I did this all the way to the end where I finally had how the brain regulates heart rate. Once I had all these questions categorized, aligning with different parts of the lecture, I actually felt like I was in control and there was something I could do about it. I've said this before, but having these questions is almost like having a map to guide you when you're studying, because you know what you're looking for, you know what you don't know, and that's the most important thing. Because later that evening I came home and I knew where to start and I knew where I was going. And I remember taking out my questions and my lecture slide and asking myself, can I find the answers to my questions on my lecture slide? And if the answer was no, or even yes, but I don't understand, I would go to another resource like Google or the textbook. Because you see, all the information you need is out there and it's available. All you need is the right questions to access them. And I remember in this specific scenario, I ended up watching, I think like 10 Khan Academy videos in a row, 2 crash course videos. And what I started to realize was things started to make a bit of sense. I had bits and pieces of information from Khan Academy, from the lecture slides, from the textbook, from Crash Course, and I took some screenshots from Crash Course, and I had diagrams for my lecture slide, and they were all scattered all around the place. And it was at this point where I realized I need somewhere where I can put all these things. I need somewhere where I can bring all this information together and make it into one coherent story, for lack of a better word. It was then where I decided to start making notes. And you know what's really cool? If I pull out my cardiology lecture notes that I ended up making, the questions that I asked while I was inside the lecture actually ended up lining up with the notes that I made. For example, I had questions about the general anatomy of the heart. So as you can see, I dedicated a section of my notes to the anatomy of the heart. And I actually took a screenshot from Crash Course because I really liked their diagram, and I annotated it myself. And just doing that helped me understand the parts of the heart. Then I dedicated a part to the different circuits of the heart, a whole page to action potentials, as I was talking about with my questions earlier, an entire page on electrophysiology. So how does that electrical impulse, that action potential, how does that move through the heart? And how does that relate to what we call ECG or an electrocardiogram? How does it relate to that? And with the ECG, I drew out each phase of the ECG in multiple steps, and the process of doing that and comparing that with the diagram of the heart right next to it actually made me understand what the ECG was representing. On this particular page here, I've got the cardiac cycle, and all I did on this page was just copy out a section of the textbook that addressed all the questions I had regarding the cardiac cycle, and just the process of copying it out, each line by itself, actually enabled me to see how these different things line up and connect. So what's really interesting here is the process of making these notes. So right from the start, taking a lecture and breaking it down through asking questions, finding multiple sources out there like Khan Academy, Crash Course, the textbook, the lecture slides to answer those questions, and bringing them together into one location, which is my notes that I've made. That process taught me everything I needed to know about this lecture. And then when it came to revising, all I needed to do was pull out my list of questions that I'd made inside the lecture and test myself. What I'm trying to say there is there's a process, and it's a bit of a messy process, and it starts off at the lecture, and I let my curiosity take over. And when I let my curiosity take over, everything becomes a chaotic mess. And making notes is a form of bringing order and structure to all my thoughts. And so in that sort of circumstance, you can see the benefit of note making. So someone out there might be wondering, are you trying to tell me that this method of studying and learning is going to work with every single subject I ever do in my entire life? And the answer is absolutely not. I shall explain. But in order to explain it, we need to move on to the second lecture that I wanted to talk about today, and that is histology. For those of you who do not know what histology means, it's just a fancy word for tissue. And by tissue, I mean tissue in the body, not the tissue you blow your nose on. So right from the start, I just started to write down as many questions as I could possibly think of. And I realized about half an hour into the lecture that I just had too many questions that were just all over the place. There was no structure, and I was actually getting lost in the questions that I was asking. And I remember taking a step back and asking myself, what is this lecture actually about? What are they actually trying to teach us? And then after a few minutes, I started to realize that the whole point of this lecture was to classify the different types of tissue found inside the body. And the moment that I identified that it was something to do with classification, I still remember thinking, tree diagram. I should use a tree diagram, because I remember seeing someone on YouTube once use a tree diagram to organize information, and I thought, this is the perfect opportunity. And so I started doing my tree diagram. So up the top I had tissue, and at that time I actually didn't even know what tissue was, so I asked myself, what is tissue? Like, what is the actual definition? And then I went through the lecture slides during the lecture, and I realized, there's 4 types of tissues. First type of tissue, muscular tissue. Now I knew what that was at that time. Second type, connective tissue. And I assumed that connective tissue connected stuff, but I still put a question mark next to it because I wasn't sure. Next type of tissue, epithelial tissue. And at that time I had no idea what that was, so I put a question mark next to it. And then after that, there was neural tissue. And I knew what neural tissue was because I knew it had to do with the brain and some of the other tissue types found in the body. And so right from the start, I've established that there are 4 different tissue types. And I remember asking myself, what makes them different, both structurally and functionally? And then after that, I went into the sub-branches underneath those main branches. For example, I went to the lecture slides that talked about muscular tissue. And then I realized there are 3 types of muscular tissue. Skeletal muscle, which is attached to your bones in your body. Second type was cardiac muscle, which is the muscle found in your heart. Thirdly, something known as smooth muscle. And at the time, I had no idea what smooth muscle was, so I put a question mark next to it. And as I was doing this, I was simultaneously asking myself, how are these 3 different muscular tissues different in terms of location, function, cell structure, shape, etc.? And I just kept continuing this process for the rest of the lecture. In fact, I spent another 20 to 30 minutes after the lecture polishing up this tree diagram. And as you can see, I was able to take the structure that was underlying that lecture and visually represent it inside that tree diagram. Now you might be wondering, how is a tree diagram a visual representation if it doesn't have drawings in it? But I believe that you don't need drawings to be a visual learner. Just organizing information in a visual way and orienting it in space in such a way actually forces your mind to see the connections between things. Because what's really interesting is that a week after, we actually had a laboratory session where we had to look at all these different tissue types. And what's really interesting is the fact that when it came to doing that, when I was looking at those tissue types, I was seeing them through the lens of this tree diagram. And taking this a step further, the main assessment that semester for this particular piece of content was a in-lab exam where we had to identify microscopic images of these different types of tissues. So me and a group of friends actually got together, and using this tree diagram as a map, once again, we made a worksheet in which we took all these images and organized them according to this tree diagram, and we created little white rectangles in which we could write the answers in, and we used that to revise for that exam. And what I'm hoping that you see with this is that there isn't just one way, there's more than one way. To sort of round up this video and to give you something that you can take away in a nutshell, I think there's 2 things you can take from this video. So firstly, there's always a process. And that process is always more than just one simple step. And with all the examples I showed today, it always started off with me taking a lecture and breaking it down, asking questions. And then I needed to find the relevant answers and information that answers those questions. And then I needed to put it all back together in my own way. And a lot of the times, the way that I do that is by making notes. But you don't need to make notes. You can do what you need to do. In fact, for some subjects, making notes might even be a silly thing. If you do a subject like mathematics, the best way to put things together is actually to apply your knowledge and do more questions. If you do a subject like history or modern history and you need to synthesize an argument, the best way to do that is actually to write an essay. But the same principles apply in the process. It's all about breaking things down and building things up. So that's point number one. Point number two, the way you break things down really depends on what you want to do. Everyone's always asking me, Samuel, how did you develop your note-taking method? How did you learn to break things down? How did you come up with your method? And the honest answer is, there is no method. There is an approach that's built around questions, but it's always about adapting based on the subject. So I was doing cardiology and I wrote out a list of questions because at that time, that was the best way that I thought I could approach it. In pathology, I made a tree diagram because that was the best way for me to visualize what I was learning. You see, in each scenario, I chose a note-taking method that I found to be the best fit for what I was learning. And so what I recommend to you is go out there, find different note-taking methods, try them out and see what is the best way to break down the things that you're learning. So just to round off the video, I thought I might say that everything starts with your curiosity. It's your willingness to trust that ability that you have inside of you to break things down. And I think a lot of people see me using the iPad and they think that if they just had an iPad, everything would just click and they'd start learning properly. But that's not true at all. You need to take ownership of your learning. You need to drive that process. And once you start doing that, yes, the iPad is an incredible tool. And it allows you to do some of the most incredible things ever, but it starts inside of you. And so I hope that today's video sort of shows you some of the different ways that you can approach lectures, but not just that. I also hope it sort of inspires you to try something different for once. And you never know, you might end up enjoying the process. So that's about it for today's video. I hope you really enjoyed it. If you have questions, please leave them down in the comments below. Thank you for watching. Also, don't forget, free download link for black paper in the description. I think that's about it. Thank you for watching, if you're still watching, and I will see you in the next video.